All right, shortly we're going to take you live to the most high-level diplomatic meeting in the world. At the General Assembly, the UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres has warned the world's leaders that the threat of a nuclear attack is at its highest level since the end of the Cold War.
Well, let's catch up with our correspondent, Sherwin Bryce-Pease, who's in the UN right now and has been monitoring today's events. Sherwin, always good to talk to you. A big time for the world's leaders gathering together. And I suppose one man's speech was perhaps anticipated more than the others?
Absolutely right. I think two speeches drew a great deal of attention here at the United Nations today. The inaugural, or certainly the maiden speech of the United States President Donald Trump, and also I think a great deal of interest in the words of Emmanuel Macron, the French president, who was also speaking here for the first time. And I think the tale of two different visions of the world in many ways. You had a bellicose United States president, a very dark speech about sovereignty and America first. He spoke about the destruction of North Korea if they attacked any of the United States allies or itself. He spoke about the deal that brought about a pause in Iran's nuclear development that was signed on by 6 countries, including European countries, the European Union and the United States, Russia and China. He called this a bad deal for the United States. He, in fact, called it an embarrassment, and it made absolutely no mention of climate change, one of the big issues facing the world today, certainly one of the thematic issues here at the General Assembly, certainly a big issue for the United Nations, and not a mention from the second largest emitter of carbon dioxide into the Earth's atmosphere, the United States. And then you had the French president, Emmanuel Macron, with a very different vision. In fact, we just come from a press conference where we asked him about, since they'd had a close relationship, the two of them, what his reaction to the words of the President of the United States were. And he said, well, he's not going to be undiplomatic, but did say that they disagreed on a number of things, including the issue of the United States withdrawal from the Paris Climate Change Agreement, but also said that he did not believe a military option in the DPRK, otherwise known as North Korea, is an option to be considered by anyone. And so you see these two different visions of how the world should react to some of the crises, the biggest crises facing it, from two of the most powerful countries here at the United Nations. France is a veto-wielding country, as is the United States. And this is why consensus in this multilateral forum, particularly venues like the Security Council, are so hard to come by. Often you have countries, if you're talking about America first, sovereignty first, those kind of insular views of how you should conduct yourself on the international stage are hurting the multilateral process here in New York.
That's something that African leaders have been concerned about, the constitution of the Security Council, pushing for reform. How high on the agenda at this meeting is that reform that I think a lot of people agree is necessary?
Well, it's absolutely necessary, and it's always high on the agenda, particularly for countries who are not veto-wielding permanent 5 members of the Council. Here's the difficulty. You've had 2 decades of intergovernmental negotiations. You still don't have a text-based negotiation process where literally you can get into the weeds, as you will, about exactly how we are going to reconfigure this Council. But the difficulty, Francis, is that at the end of the day, whether countries agree or not, the final say is from the permanent 5 members, those veto-wielding members, on any change that will happen. Those 5 countries, just as they endorse and vote for the Secretary-General before the General Assembly basically rubber stamps their decision, so too any changes to the UN Charter, which includes the changes to the Security Council, have to then be approved by those 5 members. Yes, of course it's a big issue for African countries, but I think the contradiction here is at what point do the non-permanent members that seek these 2-year terms on this Council back away from the organ completely and say, if you're not going to reform it, why do you expect us to justify, why do you expect us to participate in these meetings? I think that at the end of the day is where we are heading when countries refuse to cooperate, when they refuse to constitute all 15 members of that council.
Also heard from some African heads of state. I'm thinking Nigeria, Liberia, as well as Zambia. What's been a common voice from the continent so far?
Well, I think the big issue, we can always say that, the African leaders are always going to include a line on Security Council reform of the United Nations, but the SDGs, financing for development, the implementation, speeding up implementation so that the deadline of 2030, Peter, which is less than 15 years away now, so that, those targets can be reached. And of course, financing for development is a big sticking point here. Overseas development assistance from developing countries need to be scaled up. You need businesses. You hear a lot about the partnership, the synergy that is required to deal with the SDGs, the synergies required between business, because the commitments made by governments will not meet those targets alone. So you hear a lot from the smaller emerging developing countries about development issues, particularly financing, and very much in favor of implementation of the Paris Climate Change Agreement, despite what you hear out of Washington.
Sherwin, we've discussed what has gone before, but what are the anticipated speeches? Israel coming up, and I think that's one always to watch. And then, of course, we are speaking before the UN tomorrow.
Correct. We were initially, South Africa's President Jacob Zuma was initially supposed to speak second to last, which would have been around 2 a.m. South African time on Wednesday morning. The South African delegation, in all their wisdom, deciding that probably is not the best spot, and so they managed to change that. President Zuma will now speak tomorrow afternoon New York time, and I imagine that will be around 10:30 p.m. South African time, so do set your alarm clocks for that. Coming up today, we still, as you mentioned, are going to listen to the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Of course, the Palestinian-Israeli conflict is a big agenda item here every year at the United Nations, has been so for over 50 years. Mahmoud Abbas will speak tomorrow alongside President Jacob Zuma. Coming up today, Yoweri Museveni, the Ugandan Prime Minister, the long-serving Ugandan President, I beg your pardon, will speak later today. And then another first later this afternoon from Adama Barrow. Adama Barrow, he is the new president of Gambia, of course, a very controversial election and the ousting of his predecessor by West African troops, or certainly pressure from West African countries. So I think a great deal of interest to hear what the former security guard will tell the United Nations today.
Sherwin Bryce-Pease, main man in New York, watching the UN General Assembly meetings unfold. Thank you very much indeed for that update, and no doubt we will be crossing to
always seeps through.
Yeah. Well, I did actually meet him this time last year in New York.
Yeah, you were there.
I had a little cup of tea with him. Yeah.
So what's it like at a meeting like this? The buzz on the side,
and so much happening. It's. I mean, the whole world comes together.
And you bump into a president. Oh, sorry.
And I'm walking down the street, and across the road was Parks Tao. Everybody's there.
Yeah.
Just kind of an incredible experience. But coming back to South Africa.
Yeah, we have to.